able to enjoy our discussions together. And here we go. So we're on. Hello, everyone. This is Ron Welter again, one of your hosts for today's webinar. I have to say I'm particularly excited about this one. It's the third overall in our webinar series and the second on IT project management of validated systems. Links to the other two webinars are available at the end of this deck if you haven't already seen them. If you haven't seen the webinars, and they're worth 1 PDU each. And they're also going to be available on the PMI YouTube channel.
Okay, and then welcome. I'm Kristen Cleveland, also back for our third webinar. And I agree, Ron, this is going to be great. It's a great session. It's a little bit different for me than the prior ones. We are using these webinars to build project management knowledge in certain functional areas. Validation is one of those key areas in life sciences that project managers really need to know about. And Ron, if you remember from our previous ITPM webinar 201, validation, we emphasized that as a project manager running validated projects, you really need to get close to your IT representative to understand, IT quality representative, to understand the quality requirements for your project.
I do remember that.
Yeah, and remembering from our last session as well, we spoke about validation of your traditional IT systems, and we highlighted that the validation of SaaS, software as a service systems, provides opportunities for faster validation timelines, but there are going to be gotchas that you need to be aware of to make sure your validation package is complete. And hopefully, Ron, you remember that as well.
Yes, I remember that as well. And I also have to admit that my experience with SaaS validation is limited and benefit from my own IT quality representative for guidance for the SaaS validation.
Yeah, same here. And so part of my excitement for today is that we actually have a featured guest, an IT quality professional who's going to be helping us lead the discussion today. So welcome, Hitesh.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Thank you, Ron, and hello, everyone online. I'm very, very happy to be here. This is a great topic, really dear to my heart. I want to bring the perspective of IT quality and compliance to this group. I think we got a solid set of project managers and everyone else. So definitely very happy to get involved. With that said, let's get started.
Excellent. So here's our agenda for today. We'll first review the webinar objectives, and then we'll have a recap from our past webinars. This is a series, and each builds on the previous session, yet we do want to be sure that each one stands alone for those of us who are joining for the first time. We'll also describe some notable events, which are always interesting to remind us of the importance of the work we are doing. Then we will dig into the meat of our presentation, the validation of SaaS systems. We'll spend time comparing the documentation set for non-SaaS system implementations versus SaaS, which personally is what I needed most when working on my first SaaS system validation. So I hope that it is valuable for you as well. We'll mention the potential pitfalls that will help you avoiding the mistakes that others have made before you. And if time permits, we'll have some Q&A, though we might
I think it's back on. All right, sorry about that. Had a little glitch with our audio. So let me go back and say we want to make sure that you are getting the most out of all of these sessions. So we want you to know how to reach out to us with your questions. During the webinar, you can type in the questions that you have in the chat session, and we'll have a dedicated Q&A at the very end. And at the end of this deck, we also provide our contact information that you can use to reach out to us directly. And plenty of you have reached out to us in the past, and we welcome all of those questions and comments, because that helps us develop more content for you going forward. And then after, and seeing that this is a series, just so you know this is a series, each webinar stands alone, but we build upon those before, and it bears repeating that in our deck we'll share with you where you can watch the prior webinars, and that'll either be from our PMI YouTube channel or on the Hawkins Point channel itself.
And thank you, Kristen and Ron.
Sure.
So to all the attendees, I just want to reiterate one more thing as we go through this that both Ron and Kristen have mentioned. We will be taking some breaking points throughout the course of this. Oh, hold on. Appears some folks cannot hear anything. let's just do a quick sound check. We're starting to get some comments.
All right.
Can anyone hear us? Steve, if you're there, can you help confirm if you can hear us?
Yeah, well, I can hear you.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, audio is back. All right, thanks.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, and this happened in the last webinar,
I
so
know.
there's always something to improve upon.
Always something.
Just like any project,
It's
something's
true.
going to go wrong. All right, so
Lessons learned.
moving on.
Yeah.
For this webinar, we felt it important to have clear objectives. We mentioned in the past that as a project manager, you need to be close to your IT quality rep. So, having Hitesh here, we're following our own directions. And again, it's to have the voice from the IT quality perspective mixed with us project management perspectives, so that when you're working on your own projects, you'll have that understanding as to what they're looking for from their own words to be able to be most successful. So we will move on.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, one of the things that we want to do is emphasize some of these, the impetus for these regulations, right? Let's review some notable events here. And basically, why are all these regulations around? So before we get into all the details around some of this stuff, in the early 30s, we had poisonous solvents causing cancer to over 100 folks, deaths for over 100 folks, I should say. Then in the 60s, some medications led to over 10,000 children being born with deformities. Software errors leading to overdose of radiation, massive recalls of stents due to failures. As you can see, without reading through this whole slide here, the whole point here is there are lots of issues that have occurred over the time of these drugs and devices that we're creating to help people. Yet we hadn't had the right level of controls around how those are created, or basically some sort of a structure around keeping safety in mind. So that comes, at that point comes the regulatory body. So in this case, let's use FDA for an example within the US area. And it's really important for them to come in, set some ground rules and regulations around how do we improve the safety of these products that people will be using to help reduce all these issues that come up. Now, one last thing to mention here is we still don't have a 100% perfect set of products coming out. We will still find issues, but we want to continue working towards the right way of doing things and help improve as much as possible.
So that's really interesting. That's actually, some of these examples are new to me. So, Hitesh, you've mentioned regulatory compliance, which Chris and we've mentioned that in past webinars, compliance, regulatory frameworks and all. So from your IT quality perspective, can you provide, your, insights as to, what is regulatory compliance?
Sure thing. Well, to keep things simple, I like to think of regulations as requirements, just requirements from a regulatory body like FDA. If we can show that these requirements are being met, then we are compliant, right? The key point here is the ownership and responsibility piece. It will always be the life sciences company's responsibility to show regulations are being met. Again, it is always theirs. No, we can always partner with folks and other companies, but the ultimate responsibility is the regulated company. Again, from a quality perspective, we do treat being compliant with regulations as a key driver for safety.
All right. So then moving on to, what does the FDA regulate?
So from that perspective, thank you for this slide. Another important aspect is to understand the scope of what FDA regulates, as you said, right? Who the regulations pertain to. Chris and Ron, I'm curious as to the audience that's being represented on this presentation. If they fall into any of these particular categories that we see on the slide here.
Yeah, that's a good question. With such a large audience, we do have representation from most of these areas, and although I don't see anyone from a cosmetic company, but we do have many people from pharmaceutical companies, and I see at least one from a food company, and also multiple device companies. We also have many people from non-regulated industries, which we think is really great because this series was initially intended to share information to help project managers transition into life sciences, which we had heard through the Project Management Institute is actually a need amongst our peers.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm very happy to hear that, and that this particular session is going to be really relevant for the whole team.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. All right. Let's briefly talk about the regulations requiring validation. Can you go to the next slide? Oh, here we go. All right. So this is another brief recap. As I know in the prior webinars, there's been some discussion around regulatory framework. For today, we're going to be focusing on those relevant to validation of computerized systems.
Yeah, this is pretty familiar. So in webinar 201, we actually did discuss regulatory frameworks of SOX, HIPAA, GXP, and 21 CFR 11. And this is just more detailed information on 21 CFR 11 validation. And you use the term, quote, validation, which we've used a lot. And can you just talk about this a little bit as well?
I can. Let's it's like you're reading my mind. Let's go to the next slide here. Right? Surprise.
Yeah.
All right. So
Thank you.
what is validation? Big words, right? So having worked with so many clients, big and small, I've noticed many places use the term slightly different. And some rightly, very perfect usage of the term, some not so rightly. I'll leave it at that, right? So to level set on a common definition for this, we're going to use FDA's terminology. And what you notice here, it's actually quite loaded definition. It's a nice single one sentence, very loaded sentence. And we'll break it up into 3 key parts, okay? 1, requirements, and it's going to jump around a little bit from that definition. 1, the requirements for specific intended use. Meaning you can't just say, whatever the tool does, we want. You have to be specific on what your company needs out of this particular process and tool, and then write down those specific requirements. 2nd is confirmation by examination and objective evidence. This includes appropriate level of documentation to show right things are done, covered, and testing and the evidence behind the testing. And then number 3 out of this thing is consistently fulfilled, which means, solid change control is super important after the project goes live. Okay. From the definition, you can validate all sorts of things like equipment, devices, process. Here we're going to focus on computerized systems, a big circle in the middle. So for the rest of this conversation, we're going to focus on this, which is also known as computerized systems validation, CSV.
All right, cool.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So a nice way of looking at how we can validate computerized systems is represented via this V model. It's probably not something super new for a lot of folks, just a different representation. This helps us see all relevant elements required by phase and how they are connected. Right? The other thing to note here is that validation occurs from planning phase through deploy, through maintenance, and into a retirement phase. Again, going back to the definition, consistently fulfilled. So we need to make sure in the maintenance phase that we're able to do things the right way. So go live is not the end.
Yeah, this is familiar from validation project lifecycle in webinar 201, but we were taking it from a project management perspective. This V model I've seen before, and I realize is probably a more accepted quality model that can be used if you're doing presentations to executives and things like that.
Excellent.
So a lot of talk on software as a service, and as project managers, we have experienced different opportunities for improving the delivery speed and the cost, delivery cost, the maintenance cost of IT projects. So this list of opportunities, it should be familiar. Waterfall versus agile. A lot of discussion in project management about which is better, depending on the situation. Server versus server client versus in the cloud, configured or custom off the shelf versus custom built. Blockchain, I think, is going to be an interesting one.
Mm-hmm.
I personally haven't worked on it yet, and I know that's a tremendous amount of discussion and play with that. And then for the topic of this conversation, is software as a service, and there are benefits and there are risks. So from the benefits, we see that when you have software as a service, the vendor owns the system infrastructure, so that's not part of your cost.
Right.
They actually own the core system validation as well. We'll go into a lot more detail later about the relationship between you as a project manager when you're working on a project. But with them owning the core system validation, that takes a lot of weight off your company. Mm-hmm. And that ends up being a reduced company project team size and timeline. You can do things faster with less people. And again, you just need to make sure you do it right because there are risks. There could be this false sense of shared responsibility. I've heard some people talk as if, well, the vendor validates the software, so I don't need to do anything. You actually do need to do something.
Really? No.
They need to be clear on what you do.
Yeah.
An interesting one is lack of control of data. So that's not to say you can't control your data from within the SaaS application, but it's not on your servers anymore. It's not on your network. Do you have a multi-tenant system, SaaS offering? Do you have a single tenant? And you lack total control. So that could introduce more needs for your IT security, both from the vendor perspective and how you audit them, as well as, the communications from your own system. Then the system upgrades, they're not on your schedule anymore. They're on the vendor schedule. And most vendors, or many vendors, have periodic releases. They give you lots of time to plan it. Mm-hmm. Some are better than others, but again, it's not on yours. So now we just had another glitch.
Yeah. Sorry, guys. We seem to be having some software issues.
Yeah. All right. So now the audio is back online. So typically we only have one issue per performance here. Sounds like we have two this time. So we just discussed the SaaS risks.
Yeah. Quite honestly, these are very interesting and very important and real risks that we're talking about here. All of these items, we've seen them constantly in the industry with many companies, but the big problem with all these risks, ultimate issue is it can lead us into a very non-compliant implementation, again, leading to potential safety or whatever other risks that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. So how do we become and stay compliant for SaaS implementation? Now, we want to get a little bit away from the theoretical to a little bit more tangible activities. So what are those key things that we need to focus on? Basically, the core concepts are not going to change from normal validation process, but there will be additional focus on some of those featured areas. So let's talk about those four key pieces. One, we need to make sure our life sciences company has a solid IT quality framework in place. This includes things like validation process or procedure, change control procedures, right, and deviations, and so many other policies, procedures. We also need to make sure the vendor has a solid IT quality framework in place, and this is done through vendor audits. Right? They need to know how they are validating their side of the product, how they're implementing it, which environments, and what kind of a change control that they have in place. We also need to in this particular case, as it's a SaaS, right, software as a service, and they're hosting the environments, they're hosting the data for us as well. So one of those extra rigor that we need to do is around how they are storing the data for us. Do we have right level of encryptions, security behind it, access that we need to think about, retention of the data, and all these types of policies in place, right? The third key item here is the beneficial piece of why we're doing this, because it can help us reduce the work that we need to be validated. And how do we do that? It's by leveraging everything that the SaaS vendor has done for us, as well as many other clients, but we're the important people here. So everything that they've done to mitigate the bottom half of that V model that we're presenting, right? And lastly, we want to make sure that the vendor stays compliant through periodic reviews. Okay.
All right.
Any comments?
No questions. It's all a lot to do, though.
Yeah.
So now,
It's
how
a
do we
lot of
do
work.
it?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take a look at this next slide on how the complaint is.
Wow. I don't know what's going on with our software.
All right. Hopefully you guys can hear us again.
We can.
Okay, thank you. So let's take a look at that V model again. So we looked at a version of this previously for normal validation projects or end-to-end projects. Now, what the third key point that we mentioned in the previous slide was around how do we leverage our vendors' efforts, our partners' efforts. And essentially, it's this bottom half, which is circled, boxed around. And basically, we want to be able to say, yep, all of these areas around functional requirements, design specs, the coding, testing, installation testing, all these system testings, all of that stuff, we should be able to leverage the vendor's validation package and reference it in our validation package from our side and say, yep, all of this need is completed, refer to the vendor's information as needed. But what you also noticed visually on this slide here is that it doesn't cover everything. We still need to have our requirements, user requirements. We are the users, right? We still need to have the intended use. And coming to the other side of it, we still need to do the user acceptance testing, the trace, the final summary reports, and everything else associated to that.
So I can tell you that this is very interesting for me.
Me too.
Because when I was working on my first SaaS project, I was like, where are the differences?
Right.
So what do I need to know on what to do and consider? And I've got a vendor that has some information. I like what I see, but exactly how to tie that in and seeing it in this V model format, it actually makes it very much clear that, okay, here are the sections
It's tangible.
that it applies to.
Yeah, I think I've been asked to lead build versus buy decisions around, do we build something internally or do we buy something off the shelf from a SaaS vendor? And this would be the slide I'd show to an executive. I'd say, okay, look, just because we're buying something doesn't mean we're off the hook completely. We still have to perform all of these functions with respect to validation. And yeah, we might be getting a validation package from our vendor, and they're covering the bits in orange, but we still are accountable to the FDA for all of those validation bits. So, this is a very important perspective for a project manager, whether you're leading an actual SaaS implementation or you're performing some type of build versus buy analysis. This is a great slide to steal for your executives, by the way. Just a hint, maybe Hitesh will let you steal it.
So it's good stuff. Actually, along with this, one of the next things that we want to talk about is equally important. It's talking about the roles and responsibilities.
Yeah.
So more about responsibilities.
That gets real to the meat of the matter, I think. Yeah.
Right.
So this is familiar. Right,
yeah, definitely familiar. And we're used to seeing when we manage a validated project in terms of the volumes of documentations, like what are the documents that we have to manage? So getting back to helping us understand, if I'm new to running a validated SaaS project, what's different from a documentation perspective? What are all the milestone documents that I have to worry about? And then what do I not worry about?
Right. And the terms we're using here, as we had discussed before, each company may have a different term for a user requirement or requirements or document requirement specification, validation plan. And for the terms, we have accountable. So for right now, we're saying they're the ones who are ultimately responsible. The company is.
Meaning if the FDA auditor comes in, they have to show and prove that signatures were there and that things were followed, right? That's accountability.
Exactly.
Ultimate accountability.
Right. So then in comparison, of a SaaS system, let's talk through the differences here.
So what you notice here is the accountability doesn't really change between
that's
us as a company or whether the vendor is actually helping.
Important.
What we do here is the elements, again, highlighted in the orange box, the bottom half of the V model, we can mitigate a lot of that effort by using the documentation that the vendor can provide.
I like the way you word that. Mitigated with the vendor docs, but still the company, your company is accountable for the contents of those documents. So you better know what's in them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So a question I have, though, in looking at this, having been through this before, the terms that the company was using was user requirements that the SaaS vendor provided. But according to this, Hitesh, that it's actually the functional requirements. Can you provide some clarity on that? And then also, when you have the requirements traceability metrics, if you've got documents from the vendor, from the company, how did they all come together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, we get into this concept of, okay, here's the documents, here's just a bunch of check boxes. Let's just crank through it. It's really not that. We want to simplify it, take a step back, because what we want to understand is, the life sciences company is a user base. It has to be their user requirements, their intended use of the system that we want to focus on. So they have to identify this stuff up front. Mm-hmm. Now, we can leverage a lot of material from our vendors, like the functional requirements, like the design specs, their installs, their IQs of the installation qualifications to prove that it has been installed in the right environment, in the way that we expect, and everything else associated to it. But we need to be able to show that, yep, they're doing it to meet our ultimate needs. Mm-hmm.
Not their needs, but
not
our
their
needs.
Our ultimate needs. Exactly. And actually, one of the things that we need to be able to do, and kind of reiterating one of the things that was identified previously, is we can't just willy-nilly just pull documents from the vendor.
Right, and slap our logo on it.
Logos and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
But besides for the logos, we also need to kind of show that they are creating those documents and installing things, following the requirements to the test cases in a controlled manner as well.
Okay, so when you buy a validation package from a vendor, that's not just the end of it, right? You don't that task isn't complete when you get it delivered. That there has to actually be a series of tasks that go through that document and make it your own. So you're not just relying on the vendor's documentation.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And part of this relies heavily on the vendor audits.
Sure. Okay.
Right?
So yeah, there's a lot of prerequisite tasks before you even agree to take their documentation to make sure they have processes in place, and then that their documentation is actually reflecting your use cases. So.
And then back to the topic we mentioned many times about being close to your IT quality.
Absolutely.
Exactly how to do that in your company isn't the decision that the project manager or the business analyst or the technical lead can make. It ultimately is the IT quality department, because they're the ones who would be approached from the FDA during an audit.
Right.
So you need to make sure that you comply with whatever they have in place.
Yep. Get them into the project as early and as often as possible. That was always my stance. Just a little, sorry, non sequitur.
Early and as frequently as possible.
Early and often.
Absolutely. Yeah. Early and often. Very nice.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so then, let's talk about, we touched on some of these, so let's discuss in more detail. We're doing well on time here. What are some of the potential pitfalls for those who haven't had as much experience in deploying SaaS systems?
Absolutely. We started touching some of these, like the first one specifically right here, because we started getting into, just starting to pull documentation. Hey, here's the package documents that we received, and not doing a thorough assessment of the vendor. Some of the things that we want to do is, again, we're not talking about just buying software and configuring it
Right.
in our environment. We're talking, the whole 9 yards, where we're talking about full software as a service.
Yeah.
So they own a lot of the stuff,
Mhm.
although we're still accountable for it. It's on their environment, their systems, their controls, everything else. So we really, really need to do a thorough assessment of
Mhm.
their full, framework.
And
that they're
audits need time to be scheduled. There's tasks and predecessors there. Just around getting a vendor audit scheduled, people maybe have to fly to the vendor site, and there's maybe some budgetary considerations around that as well that you should be thinking of. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as you go through some of these audits, you want to focus on it from the business needs perspective, from the independent quality compliance needs perspective,
Mhm.
as well as overall IT needs perspective, right? Because potentially we are still administering the usage of users who's at
we have some type of
access,
responsibility.
training, and everything else.
We don't just abdicate our responsibility and give it to somebody else.
Yeah, and so with all of those responsibilities or all those considerations, it sounds like the IT quality group would need to take the lead from the IT perspective, but you could have multiple people going to an audit. That this isn't something that will be simple, that one person likely will be able to cover everything.
Exactly. You want to have the right team with the right knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to waste everyone's time.
Yeah. No, right.
So talking of not wasting everyone's time, moving on to the next item here, right? So around user requirements. So we also hinted at this one a little bit previously. So it has to be done based on the life sciences company's intended use of the system. We can't just come in and say, yep, hey, we like this Argus system or the safety tool here that's being implemented. We're going to use it completely out of the shelf, and that's our requirements. What are you going to use it for? Are you really going to use it for across all these things? How are you going to use it? You need to define that at a high level on the business process side.
So going back to the prior slide discussion in this, what I'm hearing, as a project manager, that a vendor may be providing requirements. They could be calling them user requirements. They could be calling them functional requirements. They could be just calling them requirements.
Exactly.
What I'm hearing is that the user requirements should be system agnostic. So the company should be able to provide what they need as user requirements. And then considering the vendor provided requirements, they need to be merged together between what the vendor provides and what you have as a company for the full requirement specification. And then that has to be in the company IT quality approved format. And then that becomes part of the trace matrix, URS or FRS to ultimately to UAT. So talking to PM speak here, is that right?
Absolutely. So yeah, we do pull a lot of information from the vendors' packages, but what we want to realize is a lot of the package that a lot of the vendors have focus on their systems.
Touch this. Go ahead. I think you're back on.
Yeah. So absolutely from that perspective, the requirements, and we want to just understand the difference between our needs and the vendor's needs. Okay. The third key bullet point in this pitfall here is around you understanding the full validation package. Because we're not just talking about a off-the-shelf software or configurable, something that we're going to install ourselves. We're actually relying on the vendor to do almost run through the whole V model on their own. And as they go through that, the full package, then we can say, yep, because you've gone through that, and again, we proved this through the audits and everything else, because you've gone through the full V model on your own of our installs, we can mitigate this good portion of our needs of the material that we need to go through from our side.
So when we're considering a SaaS vendor, they will have a IQ for their base system. They could have an IQ for your instance. They could have an OQ for the base system. So what I think I'm hearing is that you need to be clear on what the setup is from your vendor, what they're providing. Do they refresh, prod from their test instance? Do they have 1, 2, or 3 instances? Where did they do work for you versus their base system? And you need to look at that carefully and, with your IT quality, understand which one of these documents that the vendor provides must you review thoroughly. And that review does include what, the review that all the steps were complete, signatures were complete.
Exactly.
Because if I understand correctly, that's what the FDA they would come in to your company, request audit information. You then ultimately may need to provide the results of your review of this vendor documentation.
It basically falls within your whole validation package, all of their material.
And it could vary depending on the SaaS vendor and the product you use and how it's implemented.
Yep. And to that point, it's one of those things that it kind of helps transition to the next piece, which is, you know what? It's never going to be that exact same cookie cutter recipe.
Right.
We're going to have different vendors at different levels, and therefore it's going to be crucially important to have the right resources on our team.
Yeah.
So in this particular case, having the right quality, IT quality and compliance resource who can understand the difference in the gaps so that we can mitigate those gaps.
Yeah.
On that note of resources, we also want to have the right, resources like business analysts who fully understand what a user requirement is, document in the right appropriate manner, walk us through that business process and everything else, leading to the requirements and the trace, as well as the right specialists that can handle testing and so forth as well.
I feel like we've talked about having the qualified resources every time we talk about a project. It's something to stress again and again and again. You need qualified resources when you're running validated projects and of course, non-validated projects as well.
And as a project manager, you lead the team. So that gets back to the stakeholder management. If someone, if there's not an alignment within your team or any issues, you should have a group that you can work out with. And the problem may be just dynamics of the group. It may be, company direction. There are many factors, and it's not negative. It's just like, as a project manager, you're responsible to make sure that everything aligns up correctly.
You're responsible for the resources and escalation and communication if they're not working out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
So then it actually moves along this pretty well. So we'll do a summary. And what I ask is that if people have questions or anecdotes that they want to share in the chat screen, we are going to have some time for Q&A. But let's summarize the discussion today. Kristen?
Yeah, so I feel like this has been really great information to share. So thank you to Hitesh for coming in and providing content to us. This is great, great information for project managers out there. And just to summarize the regulatory landscape, the purpose is to increase the safety of products, which could include cosmetics or drugs, medical devices, even foods. And it's not simple. We all hear of problems when they occur. They usually hit the nightly news. They certainly affect stock prices of companies. So, we try to minimize all of these problems by having the presence and monitoring of the FDA regulations. That's what we try to do. And computer system validation, as Hitesh just explained, the fundamental purpose of this is to prove the system functions as intended. This means you really have to be clear and state the intended functionality through requirements, and then prove those requirements are met through user acceptance testing. The last one, the execution of SaaS validation project, there are significant benefits through using SaaS systems. I don't think I need to explain to anyone what those might be, but there are differences between validating a SaaS IT system versus a typical IT system. And you need to understand what those are for successful deployment and make sure that you're assuring compliance is met.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Excellent summary.
So while I did post that we were available for questions on the line before, while we're waiting for people to type any in, I would ask. So I've often heard the term qualification of systems versus validation. And I know this isn't in our script, so I'm throwing this at you, Hitesh.
We have a script?
Really good.
We have a script?
Shoot. So what we find is, actually what I've noticed is a lot of companies use the terms qualification, testing, instead of the term validation quite often in the industry. Now, again, as we mentioned in this presentation, The term validation actually has to do with the full end-to-end life cycle. We want to show and prove that what was really requested and required, again, the planning phases, the requirements phases, is actually what is developed, built, and with appropriate evidence. So now we're getting into build design phases with testing phase. And that, and actually consistently maintained, right, in that level. So getting into the deploy and into the maintenance phases. The terms qualification and testing start getting into the individual pieces of that full end-to-end life cycle. So you can qualify a particular software or hardware is installed, hence the term installation qualification, IQ, right? Things like that. You can test certain pieces and functionality, but it will not be treated the same level as validation, which should be the full end-to-end life
So
cycle.
it's validatable in a way. I don't know if that's a word versus validated. Maybe not the best of term, but I've heard that used.
You have certain components that are qualified, which might assist you in validation later on, right?
Exactly.
But the entire end-to-end system is not considered validated just because some pieces are qualified. Yeah.
All right. So we have
real questions.
Yeah, we have some real
Yahoo!
questions.
Thanks, guys.
So I see one from Katie LaRoche. Can we rely on a third party to perform the vendor audit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we can absolutely rely on third parties to perform vendor audits. The problem with that is you want to make sure that the third party is, almost a pseudo audit of that third party. You want to make sure that the third party is using the right steps, right processes. They are covering things the way that you're expected. But as you go through that, you also want to know that the vendors are following the intent of what you do. So when you use and leverage a third-party provider to do your audits, you want to make sure that you're aligned with what they are expecting to do on your behalf. Now, again, before they perform the final report of that vendor audit, you want to make sure that you've reviewed the information, the evidence that they provide, the background to it, and that you agree to all of that stuff before the final reports are established.
So regardless of who's doing the actual audit, you need to be accountable as the company hiring that third party. You're still accountable. Your names and your signatures are still there. Right?
Absolutely.
The FDA comes knocking, they're going to round you guys up, and you better, even though you didn't perform that audit, you have to be able to speak to it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So then we have another great question here. I'll let you read it. In terms of software validation, how to handle mobile application that has been developed by a vendor, hosted in local company app store, data stored in cloud service. That might be one you need to get back to.
Well, this is another one of those. So one of our previous slides started talking about a whole lot of different changes for the better in the industry, right? We talked about all sorts of like the methodologies, changes in methodologies that are occurring, changes in the types of systems and applications that we can use, going into robotics. Companies go into that. And this is another critical piece. How do you use devices, devices on cloud environments and everything else? So now you're actually getting into validating the end client, in this case, ends up becoming a mobile device. Again, this becomes a much larger conversation than what we have time for on this call. But it's definitely something we need to be aware of in this industry.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so another question. Would you also please clarify validation versus verification and computerized versus computer in CSV?
Validation versus verification and computerized versus computer in CSV. One of the issues I really have, this is a bit about my personal personality, okay? My personality aspect of things. I really hate the fact that we have so many 3-letter acronyms and terminologies used in this industry. because all of a sudden we start getting into acronyms that really mean the same thing, or terminologies that really mean the same thing, or slightly different, but it's all about people's intent and the way that they are perceiving it.
Sure.
Verification is another, my perspective is verification is another word for testing. Again, it's not the full end-to-end life cycle. Validation is when you're talking about the end-to-end life cycle.
So verification may be the same thing as qualification or testing.
Exactly.
So it just depends on, you actually have to nail down what are you saying when you say verification.
Exactly.
So as a PM, we would have to define that up front and say, what is the scope here?
Bingo. Bingo. Okay. So just as it is crucial to define roles and the responsibilities, it is just as crucial to define terminologies being used.
Because end-to-end, end-to-end validation is certainly a much different scope than verifying or qualifying a couple of pieces of software in my mind. I'm thinking of timelines, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And testing, the testing alone for end-to-end system testing is much greater than one or two pieces of software. Yeah.
And to the second portion of that question, the computerized versus computer and CSV, we didn't dig into the definition of computerized systems in detail here. I do that in some of my other presentations when we dig really heavily into the cores of CSV. But essentially, if you think about it, again, it's a little bit of terms and definition, but a computerized system or computer really encompasses a lot of things. Encompasses hardware, software, encompasses the application, it encompasses the process being leveraged behind it, the data behind it, the people being trained and everything else. So it's everything. You can have a computerized device, and then you're also doing validation of the computerized aspect of a device being used. So it really gets into a lot of nuances here, and hence the real importance around defining terminology.
Yeah.
And Robert, thank you for providing your input for the validation is the process of checking whether the specification captures the customer's need, while verification is a process of checking that the software meets the specification.
Good distinction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned before about retirement.
Yes.
And that the V model encompasses even the retirement. So retirement of a SaaS system where you don't manage the infrastructure, which is good, but then your data is there. So, and I asked that because I personally haven't been part of the retirement of a SaaS system yet.
Yeah.
So your experience?
Yeah. So one of the things that we want to do as we look at these things, or at least to get a proper perspective on things, not just from a particular software or tools implementation, we want to treat the software and tool as really a tool to meet a need. And most of the needs really rely on business processes and the data that they're tracking with those processes. Okay. Now, tying it back to your question, Ron, why I'm mentioning all this is when you retire a particular tool, the process doesn't go away. The need from the business side of the process and the data around it doesn't really go away. So we need to understand, is that data going to be transferred, migrated into a different system? In which case we need to confirm from data migration perspective.
Scope. That's
exactly.
a big scope change.
The retirement of the system, what happens to the data basically? Is it being migrated? Is it going to just be retained? So we need to understand the retention of that data over a longer period of time, depending on the aspect of the data.
Yeah, and I guess that was my initial thought, and you brought up some other important aspects. I was thinking of the data that would reside on a vendor SaaS system. We would, do you pay to host it or do you pull it back? And I guess it all depends on.
I was going to say the classic PM answer. It depends, right?
It depends, yeah.
It depends on what kind of data it is. It depends on your company's policies on retention and what kind of archival that is offered. Yep.
Exactly.
So, any more questions from online or Kristen while we have Hitesh with us here?
No, I think if we're ready to wrap up, that's great.
All right. So and this has been fun. So we went through the Q&A part already. We do have our contact points. This webinar should be posted on the YouTube channel in short order, as well as the Hawkins Point website, so you can download it. You can send feedback to the webinar team at hawkinspointpartners.com. PMI will also be sending out requests for feedback.
Okay.
What would actually be really important for Kristen and I is what additional topics would be of interest to you as a project manager, in life science or maybe not in life science.
Mm-hmm.
We're here.
Topics for project management.
Right. Our intention here is to help, give back to the community and tackle topics of interest. We can pull in experts. So thank you again, Hitesh, for coming here. This has actually been a lot of fun.
It has been a lot of fun. Thank you very much, Ron. Thank you very much, Kristen.
Yeah.
And thank you, everyone, on this webinar, and PMI for hosting this.
Yeah.
It's always good fun to talk about all these things.
Yeah, we'd like to thank the Project Management Institute and their help sharing this information to you. PMI provides a lot of great opportunities to network, learn, and also provide opportunities for you to share yourself, all while gaining PDUs. If you would like to be a guest on our webinar series, like Hitesh volunteered to be, please let us know. And I strongly suggest that you take advantage of these opportunities because they provide you the opportunity to grow your craft and to learn about other aspects of project management and to meet people. Networking is always the key. So with that, we thank you very much for your time today. Don't forget to get your PDUs at the end.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Bye.